Good morning, welcome back. Today is May 15th, and as you can see, it's quite warm outside, so here we are to look at a little bit at what happened on this date in history. Well, first of all, it was in 1164 on this date that Heloise dies. Heloise, who was an abbess at the time, she dies on this date. Now, some of you are thinking, who's Heloise? Well, I'll tell you, she was married for a time to a guy named Peter Abelard. And hence the story of Heloise and Abelard have become one of the great love stories throughout history. They're real people, 12th century, and it was kind of a forbidden love thing. They were both religious leaders, a nun, a scholar kind of stuff, and there was intrigue and all of that. And the story of Heloise and Abelard have been captured on film, in plays, in satire, in parodies and references, and it's one of those stories that has been used over and over and over again. Sort of like Romeo and Juliet, it has that sort of history. In fact, there were several poetic versions of it. One written by a guy named Alexander Pope, who, speaking of Alexander Pope, it was on this date in 1711 that Alexander Pope published his essay on criticism. Now, Alexander Pope wrote almost entirely, not completely entirely, but almost entirely in iambic pentameter. But in fact, Alexander Pope is often referred to as the second most quoted English writer after William Shakespeare. I know you're thinking, what has Alexander Pope written that I would know of? Well, perhaps you've learned or used the expression, a little learning is a dangerous thing. That, of course, is an Alexander Pope quotation. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That is an Alexander Pope quotation. 10 censure wrong for one who writes amiss. That's an Alexander Pope quotation. And of course, there's my favorite, one of my favorite quotations of all time is an Alexander Pope quotation, and that is that true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. In 1829, Joseph Smith stated that he was baptized on this date by John the Baptist. Well, I suppose if you're going to be baptized, that's the way to go. So, don't have any pictures of that, but it was on this date that Joseph Smith claims it happened. In 1869, you had the opening meeting of the National Women's Suffrage Association. This was founded in New York by several women, amongst whom were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, she of the Susan B. Anthony dollar. This came in response to the failure of the white politicians to support women's rights after emancipation, that is, after the end of the Civil War. It's kind of an interesting story, a part that I never really realized, that it was during the Civil War or in the run-up to the Civil War and during the Civil War that there was a women's suffrage movement. But they took a back seat to the abolition movement, thinking that the rising tide would lift all boats. And lo and behold, when the dust settled, African Americans were given the right to vote, but African American men were given the right to vote, and women were left high and dry. So they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Okay, today's birthday is his honor. That's right, Richard J. Daley was born on this date in 1902. He died in 1976, I believe. He was 74 years old. I remember when Daley died. I remember when Richard J. Daley was around. But Richard J. Daley, his honor, the boss, as Mike Royko put it, was born on this date in 1902. And among the people who died on this date, going back to the idea of poets, Emily Dickinson died on this date in 1886. She died at the age of 55. She was never married, lived alone pretty much her whole life. But Emily Dickinson died, as did almost 100 years later, in 1984, Francis Schaeffer died on this date. Francis Schaeffer, the Christian thinker, philosopher, he formed the Commune in Switzerland, and I believe it's pronounced L'Abri. I could be wrong on that, but wrote many books, including How Should We Then Live, was a book that I read, very interesting book. But Francis Schaeffer, and I believe his son, Frankie Schaeffer, is still around, kind of continuing the ministry that his father started. Well, that's it. So let's get back to talking about Luke. Today, I believe we're in Luke chapter 14, and we're going to continue on talking about Luke and this great reversal. Good morning, welcome back. Today we're talking about Luke chapter 14. Last week we finished talking Luke 13. Jesus had given a couple of parables, and then he talked about the narrow door versus the open door. And then it said, at the end of beginning verse 31 of chapter 13, we had that situation where some Pharisees had told Jesus to leave town, and because Herod wants to kill you, and we discussed whether or not that was a serious threat, or whether they were trying to be helpful, or they were just trying to use that as a ruse to get rid of Jesus. And I lean toward the idea that they were just using it as a ruse to get rid of Jesus. But nonetheless, there were still some Pharisees that wanted to communicate with Jesus. And it's interesting that, and as I understand it, and I am no expert in the subject, that within the Jewish culture, eating meals together is very important. I know I may have mentioned before that, we heard a guy talk once around Passover. He was given a discussion of the Passover and what it meant in the Jewish context. And his point was that eating together really signifies something in the Jewish context. More so than, say, in the U.S. context or in the Western context, where in the Western context we look at two people and say they're shaking hands. We think that's a great thing. Oh yeah, they're in agreement. Clearly they're in agreement. Whereas in the Jewish context, shaking hands doesn't necessarily mean that you're in agreement, but eating together does, or is closer to it. Let's put it, is closer to it. Okay? And so we have several examples of Pharisees, especially in Luke, and we've already talked about several, or a couple I should say, in Luke. In fact, side note here, it's kind of interesting in Luke, the number of meals that are involved. Okay, there's several discussions of meals. There's Levi throws a banquet in Luke chapter 6. And there Jesus meets with the Pharisee, with the woman, and Simon, do you see this woman? And we talked about that. That's in Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 9, there's the feeding of the 5,000. It's not a banquet per se, certainly. It is a huge meal. There is eating going on. In Luke chapter 11, there's another dinner or a meal with the Pharisees, and this is where the teachers of the law are there. Here in Luke chapter 14, we're going to talk about that discussion today. In Luke chapter 19, we're going to get to Zacchaeus, which is another tax collector throwing a big party for a big meal for Jesus. And then, obviously, in Luke chapter 22, there's their Last Supper. So it's just kind of interesting in Luke, the centrality that meals have, eating and drinking kind of thing. Just a side note, okay? But in Luke chapter 14, we have this Pharisee who wants to eat with Jesus. Now, the Pharisees, it's interesting because in Luke, if you remember in Luke 11:53, let me read the first verse. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. Okay? Now, this is interesting because if you remember when we talked about Luke chapter 11, in Luke chapter 11, verse 53, that after that particular meal, it said that the Pharisees began to fiercely oppose Jesus. Okay? So, in general, the Pharisees were fiercely opposed to Jesus. As a group, they were fiercely opposed. Now, there were individuals within the Pharisaical community that were still friendly, or at least willing to dialogue with Jesus in one way or another. Okay? So here you've got this Pharisee, a prominent Pharisee. Now, where this particular meal takes place, we don't know. He's not in Jerusalem yet. So it's somewhere between Galilee and Jerusalem. It's a prominent Pharisee. Don't know exactly what that means, other than the fact that he's got the wherewithal, he's got the means to provide a meal and be known in the community, and to draw Jesus in to come and have dinner, have a meal with him. Okay, so he goes in there, and Jesus knows right from the get-go that he is being carefully watched. Okay. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Okay, so they're in this meal, and if you remember when we talked about the meal in Luke chapter 9, I think it was Luke chapter 7, that people could come in. Remember the woman who had led a sinful life came in, and it was not uncommon for people to be able to come in. And so perhaps that's what happened. Here's a man who was ill, had disease is often referred to as dropsy, that there's this just swelling of the limbs and things. It's very clearly very visible. Okay, so it's a visible illness. And so this man is here and he's in front of Jesus. Now, that kind of suggests that they staged this. Okay, I don't know this. This is speculation on my part. But the fact that he's in front of Jesus, okay, but whatever. So this guy is there, clearly, visibly ill, visibly sick, visibly disabled. Okay, and he's there at this particular dinner. So maybe perhaps the guy had brought him in there thinking that, okay, I'm going to get Jesus this time. Maybe the guy was just a coincidence. We don't really know. Okay, so again, I don't want to draw any huge conclusions based on this, but again, Jesus is there. He sees this guy. It's a Sabbath, and he's eating at this guy's house. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law. So there's Pharisees around the table. There's experts in the law. And again, don't forget, we talked about experts in the law. Those are what we would call the Bible scholars, the theologians of the day. Okay? So he asks them, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Well, they had to remain silent because under the Jewish law, there was no law that said you couldn't heal. Okay? There were laws against working. And so the way that Pharisees always got around it, or the Bible scholars got around it, was they would say, well, that's clearly working. Yeah, yes, a miracle took place, but clearly he's working to do that. Okay? And again, you remember in Luke chapter 11, that story where, there's 6 days in the week to get it healed. Come on those days, don't come on the Sabbath. Okay? But here's Jesus. He's in front of these guys. He says, so, is there any law against this? They don't say anything. Okay, now, if they really wanted to stand up for the law, that would have been the time for them to say, yes, you can't do this today, or no, it's not allowed today, or whatever they wanted to say. But nobody says anything. Okay? But they remain silent. So taking hold of the man, again, Jesus touches the man. Now, is this man an outcast? To a certain extent, he is, in that he's visibly sick. He's visibly disabled in some way. Does that make him an outcast? Does that make him unclean? I don't know. I don't want to read into it anymore, but Jesus touches the man, heals him, and sends him on his way. Now, what that tells me right away, it says when he sent him on his way, is that this man, whoever he may be, is not a part of the guest list. Okay? So this man is either on the outskirts, or he's there for one reason or another, or maybe he just came in to see, but he's not part of the guest list, because if he was part of the guest list, he would stay. But Jesus says, no, go on your way. Okay? So now Jesus has, once again, on the Sabbath, healed someone. Okay? Now, Jesus knows this drives the Pharisees nuts. Okay? And once again, Jesus is going to make the point, a very similar point that he's made before. He asked them, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? Now, I will say that there is a manuscript difference here. Okay, so some manuscripts, and if you have an older, like if you have a King James or New King James, or someone, they say if you have a donkey or an ox. Okay, so some manuscripts, that word is child. Okay, so the new NIV, the NIV 2011, chooses to translate that as a child. Okay, but it says if you have a child or an ox, so even, and again, whichever it is, if you have an animal that falls into a pit, okay, that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? Okay, so now the picture that Jesus is saying is like, here you have this, you've got this person, you've got this donkey, you've got this child, you're walking along and boom, falls into a pit. Wouldn't you, just by reaction, reach in and pull it out? And in the same way, Jesus is seeing, when I see this person, just as a reaction, I want to heal him or her. And they had nothing to say. Okay, so there's not a lot other than that, okay, as far as this particular miracle goes. To the Pharisees, it's just another example of Jesus doing what he's not supposed to do. That is healing on the Sabbath. Healing's okay, just not on the Sabbath, right? So in verse 7, now we have this interesting passage, and let me just kind of read the whole passage, next 5 verses, and then we'll talk about it a bit. Okay, verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of the other guests. Okay? Now, this is kind of an interesting passage. First of all, it's just good advice. Okay? In fact, so much so, in Proverbs 25, Proverb of Solomon, he says, do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, come up here, than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. Okay? So maybe Jesus is echoing back to this particular passage in the book of Proverbs, but otherwise it's just good. It's just good sense. Okay? We don't necessarily. Well, if you've gone to any really fancy dinners where you've got a head table and things like that, or even a wedding is probably as close as most of us get, okay? If you're a guest to a wedding, you don't necessarily want to go sit at the head table. In fact, you don't unless you're part of the wedding party, okay? Even then, you don't want to go sit at the family table, and it's all very clearly marked. And if you don't know where to sit, okay, so and this is the scenario, you got a bunch of people in here going into this wedding, or the assumption is you're going into a wedding, you don't know where to sit, or you're going into a banquet, you don't know where to sit, and so what do? Well, you just figure where's the furthest place, okay? Then you can't lose, okay? It's a win-win, okay? You can't lose because if you sit there and you stay there and nobody says anything, well, then you haven't embarrassed yourself. But if you sit up at the head table, and the person who's running the banquet comes in and says, whoa, you don't belong there, and then everybody is going to watch you get up and get moved out. Okay, so it's just good advice. Okay, so it's based on Proverbs. It's just good advice for how to seat yourself at a wedding. Okay, just kind of make a note of that. Okay, now interestingly enough, there's a couple of other thoughts along this as well. Okay, because here you're looking at the Pharisees, and there's a bigger kind of picture. What would cause a person walking into a banquet to think I should be sitting there at the head table? Okay, well, he or she, as the case may be, is thinking I'm important enough to do that. Okay, so there's some references to this bigger banquet picture that we're going to come back to in a minute. Okay, so and then Jesus points out here at the end of verse 11, he summarizes that with a basic principle, and that is, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Okay, so again, this is the great reversal. Okay, so the way to be exalted is not to exalt yourself. Okay, and he just uses this banquet illustration, seating illustration at a banquet, as a way to illustrate that. Then Jesus is going to take it to the next level. Okay, so now he's going to talk about the inviting people. Who do you invite to a wedding? Or I keep saying wedding. Who do you invite to a banquet? Okay, then Jesus said to his host. Okay, now this is in the moment. Now Jesus is at a banquet. He's sitting there. He's talking to the host. Now he's reclining there, or however they did it. He's reclining there. He's talking to his host. He's looking at a group of guests, and he's going to tell the host who he should invite. And clearly, it's not the people that are around this table. Okay. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Okay? If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. Okay? But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Okay, so the question here is not whether or not you should invite your next door neighbor or people who are your economic equals or socioeconomic equals or your neighbors or friends at church to dinner. You, by all means, go right ahead. Okay, the question is, why are you doing it? Okay, and it kind of gets into the idea of being what's called a transactional relationship. If you're doing something transactionally, what that means is you're doing this with the expectation that it will be done back to you. Okay, the best example to me of transactional relationships has to do with young children's birthday parties. Okay, and if you have a young child and he or she is invited to a birthday party, the first time you go to a birthday party, that your young child is invited to a birthday party, you agonize over what to get the kid. Okay, what do I get him? What do I get? How much do I spend on this? What do I spend? By the 11th, 12th, 13th time you're invited to a young child's birthday party, you're not agonizing anymore. You're thinking, what did I get the last time? Or what did they bring to our kid's birthday? So again, at this point, when you get into now to the kid, and I'm looking at it from the parent's point of view, of course, to the kid, he or she is oblivious to all of this. They just see huge quantities of presents, okay, and that's fine. But to the parents, it's strictly transactional, okay? You're not getting a gift in the hopes of transforming the life of that kid. You just want to get a gift that's comparable to what the parents, when they sent their kid to your kid's birthday party. Okay, that is like the epitome of a transactional relationship. Okay, and that's okay. It isn't wrong to have transactional relationships or to invite people over in the hopes that someday they're going to invite you back or creating that kind of a relationship. That's fine. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just if you're doing it thinking you are doing some sort of great ministry, Jesus has something to say to you. It's like, you're not. Okay, your reward is that the person gets you back, or that the person invites you back. Okay, and this is kind of interesting, and there's a great concept here, and one of these days I may really delve into it, where throughout the Bible where people talk about, that's your reward. You did this, you got that, that's your reward. There's no heavenly reward. There's no crown waiting for you because you invited your boss to dinner and then your boss invited you back. Okay, that's not a mission field. Okay, that's being hospitable, and that's fine, that's good, that's great, don't get me wrong. Let's just don't call it a mission field. Okay, so Jesus is talking about, listen, in the kingdom thinking, if you're going to have a banquet, invite those who can't pay you back. Invite those who can't reciprocate. Invite those who may be grateful and may not have any other opportunity to be at a meal like that. Okay? Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteousness. At the resurrection of the righteous. Okay? So Jesus gives these instructions to the host. And again, he's talking to all of these people who are no doubt the socioeconomic equals of the Pharisee. And this is what is so interesting about this particular story. This is going on. Jesus is sitting there telling this Pharisee who he should have invited to his particular party, to his particular banquet. So you see the interesting element here. So it's probably not making Jesus any friends here, but that's not what he was there to do. Now, verse 15, I think is kind of a funny verse. I find it funny. Okay, so because what happens is when one of those at the table with him heard this, okay, so he heard this statement that Jesus had just made, or this discussion that Jesus had just made about who you should invite to a party, who you should invite to a banquet, clearly sees that Jesus has in the back of his mind a bigger banquet. Okay, and that is, and again, he just referenced it, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, a different reward. And so this guy brings up that banquet, a banquet of rewards, okay? When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Okay? Now, to me, what this guy is doing is trying to change the subject. He's trying to get away from the awkward moment where the guy was suddenly, Jesus is saying, you invited all the wrong people here. You invited all the wrong people to this particular party. And this guy decides, let's just change the subject. Let's talk about the blessed feast of the kingdom of God. Okay? So Jesus says, all right, you want to talk about that? Let me tell you this. And so then Jesus gives a parable, the parable of the great banquet. Now, I cannot help but hear this, but, when I was a kid, I worked at a camp in Tennessee, the Bill Rice Ranch, and there was a singer there, Bill Rice, who the camp is named after, Bill Rice, was an evangelist, and he traveled mostly through the South, but pretty much through the U.S., and he had an evangelistic team, and he traveled with a guy named Billy Renstrom. And Billy Renstrom was somebody who had been blinded, or had become blind. I guess he'd become blind, but he was his singer, and his wife, Ruby Renstrom, was the piano player. And so Billy Renstrom was the singer, and Ruby Renstrom was the piano player, and Bill Rice was the evangelist. And the Bill Rice evangelistic team would travel, okay? So it was Bill Rice, and then Ruby Renstrom playing the piano. Kathy Rice was his wife, and Jim Stoutenborough was the music leader. So and his wife. Okay, so the six of them would travel, and that was the Bill Rice evangelistic team. I said all that to say this: one of Billy Renstrom's signature songs was a song called "The Wedding Banquet." I cannot come to the banquet. Don't bother me now. I've married a wife. I bought me a car. I'd sing it for you, but I want you all to come back next week. But it was a song based on this particular passage. Okay, a certain man held a feast on his finest day in town. He laid a festive table and wore a wedding gown. Actually, he's talking more about the Matthew. There's a similar story in Matthew, but it's a wedding banquet. So this, Jesus could be repurposing this story just to make it a regular banquet as opposed to a wedding banquet. But the principle is the same. So every time I read this, I hear in the back of my mind, I cannot come to the banquet. So if I start humming, you'll understand why that is. Okay, so this guy sitting around the table has said, "Blessed is the one who's going to eat at this great feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, verse 16, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests." Let me just read this whole story, and then we'll kind of talk about it a bit. "At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way out to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come. Can I come to the banquet? Don't bother me now. I have married a wife. I have bought me a cow. I have fields and commitments that cost a pretty sum. Pray hold me excused. I cannot come.'" Sorry, that's the song. "I just got married, so I can't come." The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there is still room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." Okay, so this is a parable that Jesus says. And again, remember with a parable you should look and see yourself in it. So it doesn't necessarily resolve until you really can put yourself into the parable and see where do the listeners see themselves in the parable. Okay, so Jesus tells this parable. A man has a banquet, gets everything ready, he sends out, says, okay. So again, what has happened is he sent out the invitations. Everybody knows there's a banquet going on. And again, they don't have, timekeeping is not as precise as it is now. So he does all the work, everything gets ready. He says, okay, go tell everybody food is ready. So the servant goes out, and all these people that the man expected to come suddenly give these excuses that are quite frankly lame. Okay, they're really lame excuses. Now, I will say, in Deuteronomy, if you go back to Deuteronomy, there's a couple of parallels, especially the one about the first one and the last one, that is, bought a field and got married. In Deuteronomy 20, they're talking about, Moses is talking about doing time in battle. It's that who should go to battle for the country, who should go to battle for the people. And he gives a couple of exceptions of people who should not go to battle. And one of them is people who just bought land, and another one is people who just got married. Okay? Is this calling back to that? I don't know. Just a coincidence, perhaps. But regardless, they give these excuses that are lame. Okay? This guy's put this great big banquet together. You need to come. Well, I can't because I just bought a piece of land and I got to go look at it. And this is really a lame excuse. Did you look at it before you bought the land? Okay, is the land going to be the same the day after if you wait? Yeah, of course it is. Okay, I just bought a field. I must go see it. I just bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. Okay, you bought 5 yoke of oxen. That would be, as I understand it, 10. You bought them sight unseen. Okay, this can't wait a day for you to go to the auction. Can't wait a day. Can't wait a week. You just got married. Okay. I mean, I get the desire to be with your new bride. But that can't wait, or you haven't already been with her and you can come now. Okay? These are all really lame excuses. Okay? I think that's kind of the point. And I think the people listening to this would have thought those are really lame excuses for not going to the banquet. Okay? They just didn't want to go. They had the opportunity, they had the invitation, they were there, they were on the socioeconomic group as the person who's throwing the banquet. And he says, I really don't want to go. Okay. And this is annoying to the guy. If any of you have ever had a party or thrown a party, maybe a birthday party for your child, and at the last minute people start backing out. And that's really, really annoying. Okay. But so the guy says to his servant, okay, he says, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Now, do those 4 categories sound familiar? Well, they should, because that's what Jesus just told the host that he should invite. And you think about it, these guys are going to come in. These are not people that are on the same socioeconomic plane. These are not people that are typically invited to banquets like this. Okay? So they're certainly going to be grateful. They're certainly going to be blessed by being there. Okay? So the master says, go out there and get this. Go out there and get those. Well, he does. He goes around the neighborhood, pulls in all the blind, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. There's still more room, and so the master says, "Go out into the roads and the country lanes and compel anyone to come in." Okay. Now this is kind of interesting because if you're hungry, it doesn't take a lot of compulsion to get you to come into a meal. But I think here the point is, go beyond the normal realm. Go out beyond the city limits. Go find people that maybe I don't know and just say, listen, there's a banquet here for you to be at. Okay? And then he says in verse 24, I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet. Okay? Now, keep in mind, the man had, in the actual banquet that Jesus is at, had just made a reference to eating at the banquet in the kingdom of God. Jesus' response is to that statement. So it doesn't take I don't think it's a huge leap to suggest that Jesus is talking about an eschatological kind of an end times, or sort of using the idea of a banquet to symbolize who is going to be part of the kingdom of God. Okay. Now, in terms of being around a table full of Pharisees and experts in the law, Bible scholars, if you would talk about, okay, who is going to be at the banquet, who is in that social economic group, well, clearly they are. And yet, the implication here is that what Jesus is saying, I think, and there isn't clear interpretation here, but I think it doesn't take I don't think it's a wild speculation to suggest that Jesus is throwing out the idea that, hey, those of you who think you're going to get an invitation or think you're going to follow up on your invitation are not. That you're making lame excuses, that you're following this or you're following this weird law regime rather than grace, rather than what God truly wants, rather than the repentance. And the people that are going to come to the banquet are those that are the outsiders, the outcasts. It's the great reversal. It's the people from outside. Perhaps the Gentiles are going to come in. Remember what was the sign of Jonah in verse 11? or I'm sorry, in chapter 11, what was the sign of Jonah? Not that the Jews were going to repent, but that the Gentiles were going to repent. And I think here Jesus is bringing that back. And he's telling these around this dinner table to these Pharisees, and he's in a sideways way, not directly, but he's kind of in a sideways way going, there's going to be that banquet you're talking about, there's going to be a lot of people there, but it's not going to be the people you think. And who are the people they think? Them. Okay, so again, it's Jesus pointing out, or it's Luke pointing out this great reversal, this upheaval, that the outsiders are going to be the ones at the banquet, not the insiders. Okay? All right, verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, okay, so now we've got a shift. So we're past the banquet. Jesus is back out on the road. He's got large crowds. This is beyond the 12, beyond the 72, large crowds. And quite frankly, Jesus has to kind of, winnow them out. This is not unlike Gideon in the book of Judges, where, he's got an army of 20,000, and the Lord says, you got too many. Let's knock that down. And he gives them a couple of things. And so Jesus is, in a similar way, doing the same thing. He's looking at this crowd of people following him and thinking, wow, you guys aren't really following me. You're not really following the kingdom. You're here for a free show. You're here for a healing, to see something happen. Maybe you're here for a free meal. We need to really clear out why you're here. So he gives a couple of criteria as far as what it takes to follow Jesus. Okay? Verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. So again, there's sort of a difference. There's a follower, there's a student, there's a disciple, okay? And that's a kind of an interesting sort of a progression that would be an interesting study in and of itself. But a disciple is somebody who really wants to have the rabbi pour into them. Okay, he really wants to emulate what the rabbi has to say. Okay, but here Jesus is looking back on them and saying, "Listen, you guys need to understand what it takes to really follow me." Okay, and the first thing is we're getting back to this redefinition of the family or transcendence of the relationship to God with the relationship to Jesus of the family. Okay, again, it goes all the way back to chapter 3 when Jesus is in the temple. Don't you know I had to be about my Father's business? Okay, now again, Jesus is always honoring his parents. He doesn't say disobey them or anything like that. But I think this isn't I don't think anybody really believes that this is truly you have to reach a point in your life where you despise your parents or your family members. Clearly, everybody looks at this and says, okay, Jesus is talking about a comparative element. That your attachment to your family, that your attachment to your earthly possessions has to be as if it were hate compared to your attachment to following Jesus. You're all in. Okay, there's no partial. Okay, and again, we got basically when Lord, I'll follow you, back when we talked about that. So Jesus is reminding the people that, listen, following me is more important than following your family. Following me is more important in your family relationships. And if you're not willing to do that, you can't be my disciple. Okay? And verse 27, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. All right? I'm always intrigued by this idea in verse 27 where he talks about following, carrying your own cross, okay? Because when we read this, and when the original readers read this, it was after the crucifixion, and after the story of Jesus carrying the cross or being asked to carry the cross and all that went along with that, okay? But this is stated before the resurrection, or before the crucifixion, okay? So what did that mean to the original persons, okay? What did that mean to that crowd that's following Jesus to Jerusalem, okay? If they said carrying their cross, what does that talk about, okay? And I think, and again, I don't have the definitive answer on this, but if you think about what carrying the cross meant, even if you think about the experience that Jesus had, it's this public humiliation, this public recognition of this failed endeavor, okay? And that's kind of the message that the cross, carrying the cross sent. That when Jesus carried the cross, the message that the Romans were trying to send is like, whatever this guy believed in failed. Now, we know after the fact, because of the resurrection, that it didn't. But the message is, if you're not willing to be humiliated in public, if you're not willing to take the slings and arrows that come with being a believer, and they will come, you're not willing to, you can't be my disciple. Okay? Now, in terms of this discipleship, this decision to be disciples, Jesus then gives a couple of examples about how people on earth in the non-kingdom universe make decisions. Okay? Verse 28, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying this person began to build and wasn't able to finish it. Okay? Now, most of us don't have, we don't sit down and try to build a tower. Perhaps a better way to look at this is, suppose you want to remodel your kitchen. And you say, you know what, I'm going to just get into it. I'm going to just start remodeling the kitchen. And you tear everything out, and before you know it, you got a disaster of a kitchen and nothing, because you can't afford it. It costs more than you expect. Kind of reminds me of the joke, how do you add $25,000 to the value of your home? You put in you put in a $50,000 kitchen. Okay, but be that as it may, all right? I'm reminded of a church that we briefly attended that had great ambitions. Okay, and in its way, it was a very cutting edge kind of church. I mean, they had a large ministry, they had a school, they had a TV ministry, they had a lot of things going, and so they embarked on this very large building project. They were going to build this huge building and all that, and it was all on their land and stuff, but what happened was, and I guess, let me rephrase it. I don't really know what happened. I know the effect was that for any number of reasons, giving didn't keep up with what they expected it to do. And as an end result, this particular building, they were able to build the shell of this building. And the shell of this building, and by shell I just mean kind of like the girders and all, where you had you could look at it and say, oh, that's going to be a building someday. There was no roof on it, there were no walls on it. You could just kind of see that there was this huge skeleton of a building sat there for years. And it just became an albatross for this particular church, and this church eventually had to sell everything, and they changed their name. And now the church itself, the ministry itself, is still surviving under a different name in a much smaller environment. But here's the thing, that did they count the cost? Well, at the time they thought they were. Okay, but this is kind of the idea. It's like, and everybody kind of looked at it, and it became, I don't want to say a disgrace, but it sort of became something that people go, yeah, look over there. Yeah, those are those guys that started to build a building and couldn't afford it. Okay, and so Jesus is talking. He says, if you're going to build a tower, this is how you do it. You sit down and you count the cost, and you do it. All right. Verse 31, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? Okay, the answer there is probably no. Okay, I'm just saying. No general, not in the service, but 10,000 against 20,000, probably no. If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Okay? So again, Jesus is saying that in this life, in this world, in this non-kingdom way of thinking, you would do this cost-benefit analysis, and you would figure out, okay, do I have enough? And you would make plans accordingly. Okay? That's how it is in the earth. Now, then Jesus says in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Okay, so now Jesus is basically, this is the third example. Okay, so the first example is you have to transcend your family relationships to be my disciple. Okay, that following me is more important than your family relationships. Okay, number two, following me is more important than the risk of public humiliation. Okay, and following me is more important than anything you may own. Okay, and so the cost-benefit analysis that Jesus is pointing out here is you lose everything in order to follow him. That everything you own has to be subject to God's will. Okay. Now the interesting thing here is, again, so does that mean I have to liquidate all of my stuff and go live in a commune or in a monastery or something like that? There are some who do. Okay, and again, if you want to do that, God bless you. I wish you well. Okay. Yet, as we go through the New Testament and through the rest of the New Testament, we see there are believers who are believers of means, and people that were in business and people that own things that were able to be mighty servants of God. So it isn't simply a question of divesting yourself of everything. Okay. Again, it's a question of attitude. It's not a question of, okay, Mom, sorry, I hate you. Sorry, Dad, I hate you. Sorry, brother and sister, I hate you. I can't talk to you anymore because you are death to me because I'm following Jesus. It's just that my desire to follow Jesus transcends this. That my desire to follow Jesus transcends my attachment to my stuff. Okay? And that when your stuff and if your stuff is more important than following Jesus, then you're not his disciple. And I think that's kind of the point that Jesus is making here. And this, of course, would go against one of the concepts that were very common within the Jewish community, and that is that one sign of God's blessing is that you have a lot of stuff. Okay, so somebody who is rich, somebody who has a lot of money or a lot of wealth, a lot of goods, a lot of flocks and all that kind of stuff, that's clearly a sign of God's blessing. And Jesus is saying, listen, if you want to follow me, you have to kind of give all that up. Now, that's not going to go over well at this with this crowd. Okay. Now, we don't really know to what extent how this worked, whether it put away. I know in the John account, Jesus has a conversation that and several people leave. But at this point, we don't know. But Jesus is kind of trying to, cull the herd, so to speak, kind of get rid of people that are not really going to follow him, because it's not going to get any easier from this point on. Okay, it's continually getting more and more negative and hostile, and so it's Jesus certainly wants to get rid of people who are just there for the fun of it. Okay. All right, verse 34 is an oddly placed passage. Okay, it doesn't really flow with the rest, which has led some to suggest that this may have been placed later. But he talks about something. He says, salt is good. Verse 34, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Okay, it is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Okay. Now, discussion of salt here. And I don't think it's really important that we really talk about whether salt is a preservative or salt is a flavor or salt is value, because, salt was, incidentally, I live in Will County, which is named after a guy named Will County, Illinois, which is named after a guy named Will, who back in the early days of the state of Illinois made his fortune in salt. Just saying. It's free useless fact. But so salt. So the point here is that salt is good. Okay, salt is good. What makes salt good? Salt has a purpose. It's either medicinal, it's flavor, it's a preservative, it's value, however you want to define it, salt is good. And if it loses that goodness, whatever it is that makes it good, well, then what good is it? Obviously it's not. It's kind of by definition. Right? And so how can it be made good? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. And I think perhaps if we try, and again, at the risk of wrenching this text in, okay, I think he's looking at these disciples, he's looking at these followers, and he's saying, you guys have a purpose, but if you're not following your purpose to follow me, then you're really no good to me. Okay? And then and I think that's kind of the best way we can pull it in. Again, I kind of think this was placed later, but I think you can fit it in by just suggesting that the purpose of salt equates to the purpose of people following Jesus. And if you're not going to follow Jesus fully, you're just as bad as salt that has lost its goodness. Okay? And then again, he says, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay, now that's a phrase that often you hear several times in the New Testament. Okay, and I think the best, and I think one of the ways to look at this is when Jesus says this, or when Luke inserts this, and I think this is Luke kind of putting this in, and he's suggesting that, what I'm saying here doesn't apply to everyone. Okay, and if it applies to you, okay, so it's kind of like somebody is talking, and he or she says something and said, okay, you all know who I'm talking to, right? I think that's kind of the same idea. Okay. And so again, the point here, Jesus is trying, and I think in this particular passage, Jesus is just trying to make it clear to those that are following him. So these are people that are already following him for whatever reason. Large crowds are following him. He's kind of trying to just kind of winnow it out and say, okay, you guys need to understand why you're following me, okay, and then and make sure you're following me for all the right reasons. Okay. Next week, we'll talk about Luke chapter 15, okay? The parable of the lost things, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, okay? Certainly, and I think perhaps the lost son, a.k.a. the prodigal son, may be the best known story in the book of Luke, okay? But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that next week. So thank you very much for being with me. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know. Thank you much, and I'll talk to you next week.